Yes, and welcome back to Tent 1. We will be talking LGBTI plus in employee networks, and as always, we both take questions from the tent and online through the little box below the stream. I don't have any more to say, but Yannick, would you please introduce yourself and your panel?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to also seize the opportunity to say welcome to Copenhagen Pride Week, and in particular to this talk about employee networks, in particular LGBT plus employee networks. It's brought to you, so to say, by Copenhagen Business School in collaboration with the Danish LGBT Business Network. And you can find us on Facebook or go to cbs.dk/diversity if you want to know more. My name is, as mentioned, Yannick. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Copenhagen Business School, studying organizational diversity. I think that's the short version, at least. With me in the tent today, I have Ulla Dalsgaard. She's a Nordic Learning Partner in IBM, and more importantly for today's topic, she's a founder of Danish LGBT Business Network 10 years ago. So it's the network's anniversary, isn't it? Yep. And then also from a live stream from the UK, we have Anna Einarstadtir. She's a senior lecturer from the York Management School, researching currently the effects of employee networks in the NHS, so the National Health Service in the UK. You will have ample time in a minute or two to expand on yourselves and also your work and how it relates to today's topic. I would like to say, before we move on, that we're streaming live. That means if you don't want to be recorded on camera, you should sit behind the camera. Otherwise, it'll only be your back, so it should be pretty anonymous. It also means that you can ask questions, even if participating in virtual space. In that case, you should send it in writing, and I should be able, I've been told, to see it on the tablet. I think to kind of ask the obvious as a starter and not take anything for granted, an interesting question would be to ask, what is an employee network? What is its purpose, and what do they do? And maybe we should begin with you, Anna, just to test the connection. I hope it's a good, a stable one. At least we can see her. I don't know, can you hear us, Anna? Doesn't seem like it. So while we're working on the connection, I can then ask you instead, Ulla, because you're present in the tent. Much easier.
That's much easier. Hello, everybody. If I'm looking at my iPhone, it's because I have notes on it. It's not because I'm playing Candy Crush or something, so bear with me. But basically, a network is a group of people who have something in common. So, as a woman, I might be a part of a woman network, or I might not be. It depends on whether there's something in it for me. And the same goes for LGBTI networks. If you're not receiving anything from the network, you won't be there. It's as simple as that. But it's a gathering of people who have something in common.
And I don't know if you are with us now, Anna, and would like to also add your definition of an employee network.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this invite. Sorry I missed you just the beginning of it, but yes, employee networks, they are for the type of a network that you're talking about today, LGBT network, are for anyone who identifies as LGBT, and often allies are included with that too. And member networks usually aim to work for the members, but also for the organization that they represent. So that's kind of like a really boxed and a basic kind of definition of what employees networks, an LGBT network in this instance, might mean.
Yes, and if you have to be a little more concrete, how is it more specifically that they work for their members?
I think there has to be something in it for the members. Usually members are seeking support from each other by virtue of their identities. This might be, in some instances, purely social support, breaking isolation. It could be to forge connections with other people across other networks, for instance. So there's lots of different reasons for you as as an individual, as a professional, why you might want to join a network. Interestingly, we know a little bit more about other networks too, and for other networks, career progression and support in career progression is quite a vital element of networks. This is not what we saw in the LGBT networks, however.
And as I mentioned in the beginning, I don't know if you could hear that, but I actually mentioned that you're doing research and you're a couple of years into a research project investigating or examining, exploring the effects of employee networks on the NHS and how you can kind of mobilize the networks to build more inclusive work environments. Could you maybe share some of the preliminary insights from that project?
Yes, of course. I suppose when we started this process, we didn't really know very much about LGBT networks and who were actually involved in networks and what their impact was and so forth, both for the individuals that are in the networks, wider LGBT community and the organizations themselves. What we see in terms of membership, just briefly, is that LGBT networks are actually not as diverse as we might think. They tend to be actually quite homogeneous in terms of sexual identity and gender identity, and also other diversity such as race and ethnicity. And then when we trying to measure the impact of networks, that's really not a straightforward thing and really difficult actually to pinpoint. What are the real benefits for you as an individual of being a member and for the organization? And this is often what both ourselves as research team and the networks themselves are grappling with.
I casted you for this debate to take like two different positions, so one as a practitioner and another one as a researcher, and I would like to pass on the torch to you, because you founded, as I mentioned, 10 years ago, the Danish LGBT Business Network, and I was wondering why you did that and why in particular that network, because it's special in the sense that it's not an internal network in your own organization. It actually started from the very inception as a collaboration between Microsoft and IBM, so a cross or inter-organizational network, we may say.
It was, IBM has an employee network called Eagle at IBM. Microsoft has one called Gleam, and we decided on a conference held by Microsoft to join forces and help other businesses and organizations create these employee networks, because we think it's important, and maybe we should say why it is important, but let's get back to that. So 10 years ago, we founded the network, and now we are close to 1,200 members. And it's for free. We meet face-to-face, or we used to meet face-to-face, 3 or 4 times a year. We had a meeting virtually yesterday, which was hosted by the University of Copenhagen. So there's something in it for the members, and we are very much relying on the associations that host us, who dare to host a meeting and promote it internally and provide soft drinks or maybe something to eat, which is available for all members. It's fantastic. And as Jannik said, we are available on Facebook, and everybody is welcome. I guess we're 90-95% LGBTI, and the rest are allies, are our friends. But the only thing we do when we let in new people is try to evaluate whether they have some kind of affiliation with an LGBTI. So if it's a completely hidden profile and you can't see a zip, it's probably not going to happen. But somebody who knows somebody, or is openly gay or whatever is very, very welcome. We have a few journalists who are then asked, do you want to participate as yourself or do you want to meet somebody from the network, because this is not the place. And then they politely decline and go somewhere else.
So I guess that is also an issue of making sure that it remains a safe space for the employees or members that it's supposed to represent.
It is a closed Facebook group, so nobody can see from the outside who are the members, and you are supposed to be there as a professional LGBTI person. It's not a dating site, it's not for social events, it's for something which has a business or education kind, or a survey, or a question, how do we do this and that in my company? And then you get tons of replies to it. So we try to keep it professional.
And you mentioned that the network meets 3 to 4 times a year at workplaces that dare to invite you in. So in your experience over the years, have more organizations, so to say, come out of the closet as a host for the network?
It's becoming increasingly popular now, which is great. More and more people have heard about us, and that's why somebody is more than willing to host us now. We take contact through the members. We might hear of an institution or an organization and say, okay, who do we need to talk to? So you or I take the contact, and they are usually more than willing to host us, really, because it's a good thing to do.
And then one more question for you, Ulla, then I'll go back to you, Anna. I was just wondering if there is any risk of, now we know the users or some of the users of a network, if there is any risk of also abusing the networks on behalf of the organization, in the sense that they can use it as window dressing, saying that in the CSR reporting, that we had this network visiting, look how inclusive we are, and we focus on diversity, etc., etc. So do you have any experience in that, and also how do you hold them accountable after the network meeting?
So I haven't heard of anything where a business said, now we have a network, that's a tick in the box, so we're diverse, right? So not that kind of abuse at all.
I guess that's good to hear. I would like to go back to you, Anna, because do you, in your research, find examples of a mainstreaming of the networks that kind of turns into a misuse of them, so it doesn't really make any difference, you just end up sidetracking or forming these separatist groups where you don't really have any institutional support or resources to actually make a difference?
Yes and no, I suppose, is the best answer to that. I think there's always a danger if the purpose of the network is not very clear. Then it's very difficult to know what you actually wanted to achieve with the network, both in terms of for members and also for the organization. It is within a context like the National Health Service in England and in the UK as a whole, which is seriously cost deprived. So people are doing this on a volunteer basis on top of their own jobs. They become members, they chair networks and so forth in their own time on top of their normal job. And that is a really big undertaking, a big role to take on. So I think in terms of what they could achieve is probably unrealized, because we cannot expect people to do as much on a voluntary basis. And yes, there's always a danger that when you want to be taken serious, and there's this huge pressure on networks to operationalize themselves. So they're actually have got most of the case studies, or all of the case studies that we worked with, except for one, we worked with 9 networks. The central activity they had was meetings, for example, and these meetings were heavily controlled by huge agendas, which were very difficult to get through. There were minutes be taken and so forth, and all in the drive to order be taken seriously and to legitimize the existence of the network in an organization. But the downfall of that is, of course, that other issues, such as personal issues, and interactions between members become deprioritized. And this is when it becomes difficult. And you use the word abused by organization. I would not take such a strong stand, but rather to say that because of the drive to be taken seriously, there's a lot of compromises that have been made on the expense of possibly meaningful conversation between members, because they've got such a long agenda to get through to really prove their point with an organization.
I would like to pick up on something you said in the beginning of your answer, this part of volunteering, and that I guess it's the diversity subjects, so to say, that that carry this burden of taking initiative, first of all, but then also making sure that the network actually runs properly in the organization. I guess in order to make sure that it gets a foothold, then you need to do some sort of mainstreaming, and you also need to get allies. Ulla also mentioned that we in the Danish LGBT business network have allies. But of course you also need to balance how many allies vis-a-vis the LGBT plus members that it's supposed to represent. How does the NHS employee networks go about doing that?
I think getting the right balance and kind of including allies in LGBT networks is tricky, because you have the attempt, there's power in numbers, and lots of the networks are really struggling with the membership, the number of people actually attending meetings. They were very difficult for people to attend meetings because of their work duties. People couldn't be relieved to attend meetings and so forth. So when including allies, I think there's lots of positive in doing so. But what we saw also was that including allies wasn't considered very well, because it's all good and well in opening the networks entirely. And then many of the networks found themselves in a situation whereby LGBT identified people were in a minority, and quite a large minority, and the networks had become more or less a networks of allies with few LGBT identifying people, which is not really what these networks were set up for in the first place. So getting that balance right is tricky, and also making sure that allies, think for yourself about what people can bring to the table on the virtue of their own identities. And these are different things. And sometimes not enough considerations are given to this, what people can bring to the table on the virtue of identities, which make their own position uncomfortable because they don't know why they're there, and what they can expect, and also what is expected from them. So a bit more clarity would really help on that.
And how do they learn why they are there? Is that something that happens in the network once entering and becoming member of it, or is it something that ideally should happen before?
If I may answer that one, I think ideally such conversations should happen before, and it should be an ongoing and open conversation at meetings. We were really surprised about how little conversation took place at meetings about identities, a different kind of identities. And there was this real silence about all identities. And I would think you need that conversation before and ongoing, because things change and shift, and it's very, very important to be able to respond to that in a meaningful way.
Just let me know if I'm going on a sidetrack here, but I know that you're also working with the idea of materializing diversity, and I think it's related also to this research. Again, let me know if I'm wrong. But the idea basically is that part of what a network does is to, for instance, produce merchandise and so on, like we do when participating in a pride parade, t-shirts and so on, so you can see that we actually have this network and who is a member and who is not and so on. And then of course you have the issue in the NHS, as far as I'm concerned, that if you're an ally wearing a lanyard in rainbow colors, for instance, it might send a signal to a patient or a relative that I'm actually a trusted go-to person, while that may not be the case. Could you please expand a bit on that?
Yeah, a lot of the networks we were working with were used kind of rainbow type of material of different kinds, like lanyards, mugs, flags, you name it, badges, all sorts of things. And one can really understand why they were doing it in some way, because by distributing material of this kind, they could really evidence impact. They could really kind of showcase that they were actually doing something, and something possibly worthwhile. The lanyard scheme that I focused on quite extensively, it seemed to revolve around allies. And as you said, Yannick, about signaling to other people that you are, as an ally, a safe person to talk to. But, you know, it is really, although obviously the lanyards and other rainbow schemes have increased the visibility of possibly LGBT issues, it's nowhere near. This is not where it should end, and it's only the beginning of something. But often the network really didn't know what they were raising awareness of with the material, other than passing it on to allies as a way of signaling support of LGBT issues, and also that they will be an understanding person to speak to.
We are almost halfway through, and so I would like to remind everyone that you can also ask questions also here in the tent. Just raise your hands and you can send in your questions. I'll be able to take them on the tablet. Otherwise, I think we might begin this second part by asking the question that you posed, Ulla. Why are networks important?
If I can take that one first, there are two reasons for employee networks. One is that is good to be among equals. You have a certain language, you don't have the minority stress of being with straight allies, but you are among a group of yourselves. You can joke about the things you did, which you might not say to a heterosexual partner. So it's lack of stress. It's just easier, and that's more important that you might know, because we have a tendency to look around and find people like us wherever we go. That's one thing. The second one is the more you get together and actually talk about these issues, the more lively they become. It's like having a department meeting. You could actually write everything down and send out an email, but you don't. You get together and talk about issues, and the same goes for LGBTI. The more you talk about it, the more aware you become, and the more it fills your memory, because we have a tendency to forget. And if you find out that somebody is in the same boat as you, or struggling with this issue, and you might have a solution, it awakens you, so to speak. So even if you're not an activist, it's still good to have a network.
Do you have anything to add, Anna?
Just to say that I agree with a lot of points that Ola mentioned there, and also to say that I think networks can be an incredibly important tool for people to access, but there's a lot of consideration that has to be done for it to be effective and successful. And I think, as I said earlier, the fine balance between working for the members and working with the organisation or for the organisation is really difficult to achieve. And a lot of network ends up in doing things that are possibly better for the organisation, but on the expense of members and them getting to know each other, through prioritising their professional identities rather than their personal identities at meetings, for instance.
And can I just ask, what are some of these things that are at the expense of the members, but probably still beneficial to the organization?
I think for the organization, so LGBT networks are very much at the forefront of equality and diversity inclusion strategy of a lot of organizations. And they're often mentioned in the context of this is what, this is what we're doing with the LGBT community. And it is, very highly regarded in some organizations to have actually an established network. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization is heavily involved in what the network is doing. It may be, it may not. And I wanted to kind of raise another point, which is about who actually starts the networks and who, whether they are established from the ground up by LGBT people, or in conjunction with the organization, or entirely by the organization itself. And we've seen example of all, really, but mostly it's done between LGBT identifying members and the organization. And that often goes really well and can work very well for both parties. But it's when organizations put networks on, often equality, diversity, inclusion representative in organization are keen to set those networks establish them. And it's those networks who really struggle with sustaining themselves and sustaining membership, and that proves to be a problem in the long run.
So it's important who takes initiative. I was just wondering, because we know the Danish LGBT business network has been around for 10 years now, but how widespread are they in the NHS, and for how long have they existed? Is it a relatively new phenomenon, or is it something that's been around for maybe even decades?
It's difficult to say how long they've been there, and nobody really knows. When we spend quite a lot of time with each network, attended numerous meetings, activities with them, and interviewed a whole host of people in relation to them and members. So it's very difficult to say or map the history of the networks or each network. And usually people don't know because the membership is very transient. So you always have people coming and going at different times in their careers. They are widespread. Networks are quite widespread. And our survey, for example, shows that within NHS trusts in England, about 72% of the trust report to have an LGBT network. But as I say, it's very difficult to estimate, how long they've been in existence. Our guess is that most of them have been there for quite a while, although we did also work with very recently developed networks. And approximately 30% of the LGBT identifying staff in our survey are network members.
All right, so based on the combined experience between the two of you from practice and from research, I would like you to take turns and maybe share some best practice advice for how to run such networks.
Okay, if I should start, you need to make it interesting to be part of that network. So people go in all kinds of company groups to learn about things. Well, we go in the business network to learn about things too. So you need to make it interesting. There needs to be something, not just talking about yourselves, but maybe an event like Copenhagen Pride, or you need a conference, or you need to have a meeting with your management about the status of LGBTI in your company or your organization or whatever. The network will probably not live by itself, not for very long. So if you don't have any events to attach it to, it's not going to work. So you need to make it professional. There should be somebody driving the network. That might change over time because people leave wherever they're at, and it still needs to be somebody who has the energy to do it, who wants to put something in it and attract others to do so. It's not supposed to be an HR thing. It's not supposed to be organized by a department because it's a good idea. It needs to be somebody who has the passion to do it, and it's usually somebody on the floor, but that might change over time. And then you need to have some regular meetings. You need to engage your management, because if they don't get it, forget it, right? So they need to understand why we're doing this. It's not just because it's the right thing to do, but there's a clear business case for diversity, and they need to understand that. So if you haven't engaged your management, you should do so.
And just again to make sure that everyone is on the same page, what is this clear business case for diversity, if you can say it in a sentence or two, maybe three?
Yeah, the business case is one: you need to attract talent of all kinds, regardless of the body the head is sitting on. So if you divide yourself and you only attract middle-aged men, for example, you're losing a lot of great talent there. Secondly, if you want to be innovative, you need diverse teams. Every research says so. You need both men and women and those in between. And you need both old and young people as well. So diversity in teams is a good thing. It's more work, but it's a good thing. It produces better results. Then you need to mirror the market, because if I go into a bank and it looks very straight to me, I might not be there the next time as a customer. But if I know that they have an open approach to whom I'm married to, they don't automatically assume that is somebody from the opposite sex. I feel welcomed. I don't think about being there. That's a good thing too.
So a lot of good arguments for diversity in organizations, so team productivity and problem solving, creativeness, inventiveness, representation for the political consumer, and so on. I think there are even more good reasons. Maybe you, Anna, can also add to that. But back to the best practices, if you have something to add to Ulla's list.
Yeah, I think I'd like to kind of recommend that be clear on your purpose as an LGBT network. That's absolutely crucial, to know what you'd like to achieve and what are the issues that you would like to be working on. And then secondly, I think it's really important to create space for sharing of personal stories. And this is often forgotten in the context of work, where professional identities are completely prioritized at the expense of our own personal identities. And I would say, get to know your members. And this is really crucial, because if you don't know your members, you don't know which groups are overrepresented in the group and which groups are underrepresented. So that goes back to Ulla's argument about the importance of diversity and really to know where you need to be reaching out and where you might need to be looking at where you can balance it in better ways. And then I'd say it's important to seek support, but only when you need it. So a lot of networks had equality, diversity, and inclusion leads or people from HR attending meetings, and that usually wasn't very helpful. What is helpful is that when you need the help, you go and seek it. But constant presence of EDI leads and HR represent didn't work all that well. And then finally, for networks, I think there's a lot of learning that can happen if you work with other types of networks. For instance, BAME networks, women's network, disability networks. And this is also go back to the diversity issue and about how you can actually learn from other networks to work with different groups, possibly, about how to engage with them more effectively. And then I'd like to make a few suggestions also for organizations, because it's not just the LGBT networks that have to do all the work, because the organization have to do their bit as well. So first, I would say really important is for organizations to help LGBT networks to raise their profile. And this goes way beyond taking a photo of yourself as a senior executive with the rainbow flag. It has to be more than that, and much more than that. And then secondly, support and consult networks. We didn't find a lot of evidence for a lot of consulting going on, which I think is a really underused source for organizations. LGBTQ networks could be engaged with much more effectively. And then finally, you need allocation and time release, so people actually are able to attend LGBT network activity, so also to see the network grow and ensure that it's sustainable in the future.
What kind of help could it be that these networks need, and also your point about the intersectionality, so the collaboration between different networks? How do you go about doing that, not knowing that you don't necessarily have a silver bullet for it?
Some of the networks actually work quite effectively with other LGBT networks or other types of minority group networks. And that seemed to be really important in terms of opening people's eyes for the importance and the significance of how our identities kind of intersect, and how much we actually don't know about different types of identities, and how much learning can be gained from working with and across networks. And I think that's a really important point. And also to work with other LGBT networks, because working in isolation is never that brilliant. And it's very, very difficult to keep motivation levels up. So expanding beyond the organization can be very, very useful.
And Ulla, you would like to say a few words about that as well?
Well, I have a commentary, just maybe it's offline, but I encourage you to go ahead and start an employee network, and there are different kinds of network. Just getting together with people you know at a lunch twice a month or something is a start. It gives you, it fulfills the purpose of being among equals. It fulfills the purpose of being able to talk about LGBTI issues or something completely different if you like to, but it fulfills the purpose. So it doesn't have to be a great thing to do. You can have a lunch club. You can have, what we have in IBM, somebody who's been around for a while. We are only far fewer than we should be based on the company's size. So we are sort of a mature network which might die again and then reconvene in a few years' time. And then there's somebody who has a full-blown network with a budget and hundreds of people marching in the Pride Parade. So there's all kinds of things between that. But you can start off with just meeting and having lunch with people and see if it grows.
I can't help thinking if there is also a potential, or it should perhaps be a risk for any backlash from colleagues and managers, etc., if you, as an employee, take an initiative to form a network?
Well, in the company I work for, we have the opportunity to do almost everything, because you're not able to discriminate an employee on the basis of sex or gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, etc., etc., etc. So if we feel harassed in any way, we can escalate that to somebody who will listen. That might not be the case in other companies, other organizations, but I think that managers have got it by now. It's becoming more mainstream to understand that this is a good idea. It does give you profit that everybody is able to be themselves. So I have to support this. Otherwise, I'm not a modern manager, really.
So it may actually be a privilege of, because IBM and Microsoft both are multinational corporations, they have a rather big size in terms of number of employees also. in terms of the products they sell and so on. Is it then more difficult, you think, to actually establish a network in a medium-sized or small-sized company, because those are the most common in a Danish context?
It shouldn't be. And you probably know who's part of that network. I think in a large corporation, you don't necessarily know who are the contact people. So it shouldn't be any issue for you to do it. Maybe HR doesn't know, maybe the top management doesn't know yet, but you have the opportunity to go there and tell them.
Do you, Anna, have any stories of backlash or tensions, friction from establishing these networks or working actively with the networks?
Yeah, we do. I think Ulla mentioned being an activist, and I'd actually like to kind of expand on that point, which came up in conversation numerous times with the people that were involved in our research. So overall, people were very reluctant to identify themselves as activists, and they really want to be seen as advocates and supporters, which in so many ways actually summarizes the risks of and the dangers of being employed, and being vocal and possibly critical to and about the organization. That's really, really difficult. So I think for many employee networks, including those, many of those that we work with, those kind of tensions were always apparent. And most of the networks used quite safe campaigning ways of raising awareness to what they were doing, for example, with all the merchandise that they were using. And none of them were really confrontational or difficult or challenging in a way. And they didn't want to be seen as troublemakers. So it's always that tension between being radical or critical versus actually doing possibly more mainstream thing that is less challenging and possibly more safe.
Does it then become easier for the members of such a network to be more in the eyes of management, perhaps more radical over time as you become more mainstream or accepted in the organization?
I don't really know the answer to that. It's not something that we particularly witnessed, that your seniority, if you like, would open doors to be more critical. We just generally found that there was a real consensus politics going on at meetings, and it was really difficult, as it appeared, to actually have a healthy debate at meetings, and those were very rare. And we were really surprised by that, because there's lots of contentious points that people could possibly be engaging with, and they were not. But instead, the emphasis was on gaining consensus on the expense or possibly debate, and grow and evolve as a network as a result of that.
And then I guess the other side of the coin to backlash would be maybe a spillover effect, so that others than the LGBT plus people that the network is supposed to represent do actually benefit from the presence of the network, perhaps in terms of actually making the work environment more inclusive also to other people. Do you have any examples of that from your research, Anna?
Yes, of course. Networks can really have an impact, and they have, and they do have an impact, but they have to be run in a very, very balanced way. And we saw very good examples of where networks were really active. They were actually running different kinds of activities, all sorts, and that's really important, because you don't have, if you want to secure membership and if you want to cater to as many people as possible, meetings just don't do it. They're not sufficient. You have to have a whole host of other activities to really sustain membership and to cater for different needs, but because people will join networks for very different reasons. Some may be there purely for social needs, whereas others may be there for more strategic impact. And on the whole, there was general satisfaction with the networks. People were really happy in the networks, although we might, might not always see the positives, or we were really missing the debates. We were really hoping that there were actually debates, but people were really satisfied with how the networks were operating.
Would you like to add a comment as well, Lula? No? Making sure that we keep time. Was that a raise hand or a scratch? I think a scratch. Making sure that we keep time, I would like to end with a public service element. So in case somebody in the tent or out there in virtual space feels empowered now to go out there and start their own network, what is the best piece of advice that you can give them? Starting with Ulla.
Starting with me, again, engage management, top management. You need to find a way to have a meeting with top management and explain the business case for diversity. You can just Google it and look it up. And by the time they've got it, you have the authority to go ahead and do something. But if top management doesn't get it, you can forget the rest. Their way of doing that could be in various degrees of commitment. It could be having a meeting with you every quarter. It could be waving the rainbow flag. It could be hosting an event like the business network. It could be budgeting, giving you some money to go ahead and do whatever you do, or vice versa. So there are different degrees of what they need to do, but you need to engage top management.
And on to you, Anna, your best advice for someone who would like to start a network of their own.
Know why you want to do it. Meet with people, like-minded people, first, before you start to involve maybe the organization. I would say that probably is the most effective way of doing things together. It doesn't have to, size does not really matter in this context. So a lot of network have fallen for the trap that think that they have to expand their membership extensively. But actually what you find is that you only need a really dedicated core number of people who really want to make a difference within their own circles and for other LGBT identifying people within an organization as well as colleagues. So get together with a number of colleagues first, find out what it is that you'd like to do together, and find out also what is going on in the organization, because lack of information about what is going on for other LGBT identifying people in organizations can also be an issue. So you need to know that your experience in the networks is not exhaustive of what other people might be experiencing in the organization. So you need to find out.
So to summarize, meet the people that you want to form a network with. It doesn't matter how many or how few, size doesn't matter in this case. And then engage management and make sure so that you have that support as well. Another way of making a list is also asking the question what you should avoid to do. Because we might as well just learn from the two experts. So what doesn't work? What will definitely fail?
This is actually more difficult than I thought. So try not to make it social, because that will die out eventually. So it's not just meeting for a cup of coffee or a beer. That will eventually peter out. So you need to have some meat on the bone for people to stay around.
And you, Anna?
just be sure about and ask yourself as a network, so what are people actually gaining from attending the activities? And put yourself in the shoes of everybody in attendance and explore, is this really what people might be looking for? And be open to change and adapt and evolve. I think that's really, really important. And one thing I would say, one of the biggest learning from our study is that meetings are not the answer. They can be a very difficult space to discuss often quite sensitive issues. So there needs to be a balance between meetings and other types of activities, and hopefully then there is a better standing or footing for networks to operate and to cater for members and their different needs. But meetings are really not the only answer.
And I think that takes us to the question that we ask for this debate in the description in the program. Are they good for more than wining and dining? Of course, wining taking the dual meaning that you drink wine while dining, meeting together, doing social events in the network, but also maybe that you talk about how difficult it can be to be discriminated against and so on in your workplace. And that is, of course, important, but I think we've learned from today's talk that it's also important to do more and make it professional, to get the support from management, institutional support, in order to actually make this network mobilize a more inclusive work environment. I would like to thank you, Ulla, for joining us today, and also you, Anna, on a pretty much stable connection. We could hear you all the time, which I guess it's a good thing. Thank you also everyone for joining us today. You will be able to rewatch this debate, I think if not already now, then later today or tomorrow when it's uploaded to YouTube. And then again, if you want to know more about the issue, you can go to cbs.dk/diversity, where we post regularly what research is being done in organizational diversity and inclusion. Thank you.